Can Australians face up to real carbon reductions? Hi, I'm Rob Parker from the Nuclear for Climate campaign, and today we're going to look at a plan to achieve real carbon reductions at an economic price for Australia. This talk will be divided into 3 brief videos. In this first one, we're going to discuss the extent of Australia's carbon emissions and look at what our reduction targets should be. In video 2, we'll look at very deep emissions reductions using nuclear energy to replace coal plants. And in video 3, we'll examine where nuclear power plants could be constructed within Australia and what issues need to be addressed in siting them. I don't think most people in Australia recognise how large the issue is of carbon reductions. And I'm not certain that most people realise what segments of our economy and how large they are actually produce these emissions. This pie chart hopefully clears that up. It shows, for example, in the darker green zone, the emissions that are coming from our electricity generation. They make up about a third of Australia's emissions. But our domestic emissions, which are what most people focus on when they buy the PV panels for their roofs, they only make up about a third of that. So focusing only on domestic emissions really misses the whole point, because in practical terms, they're really only about 1/9 of our total emissions problem. If we go now into the next segment in this pie chart, that's the red zone, we see that makes up about 17% of our emissions. And that's the area that deals with what we call stationary energy. That's the energy that, for example, goes into manufacturing cement, or for the diesel that's consumed in generators on mining sites, all of those sorts of areas. The next one around on the pie chart, the light green colour, that's our transport emissions. That's about 16 or 17% as well. And that's a real problem because Australians appear to be completely addicted to private motor vehicle use. And now, these days, they're driving more SUVs than ever, and unfortunately these things are getting bigger and they're using more fuel than ever. So they're a problem. And of course, getting Australians off their addiction to air travel is another problem. So societally, people are finding it very difficult to reduce emissions in the transport sector. The remainder of the pie chart deals with things such as fugitive emissions or agricultural emissions. And agriculture is interesting because it on its own is a larger segment than our domestic electricity emissions. And for example, for the average Australian family, one day of not eating red meat is the equivalent of one day of 100% clean energy. The two, in terms of savings, are roughly the same. So red meat consumption is really a huge emitter of carbon dioxide. The electricity generating sector, that's the dark green zone, that should be the easiest sector of all to reduce emissions in. It's not, in Australia, a very easy sector to deal with, but it should be, because frankly all the generating plants are stationary. Unlike cars and cattle, they don't move around very much. And further, we also know that in the laboratory of real life, it's been done before. We know, for example, that in Sweden, France and Switzerland, their emissions are all down around 50 grams of carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour, while here in Australia, we're up around 800. And so our massive difference should be giving us a huge opportunity to reduce, if only we took the precedent that's been set, for example, in France, to really make large emissions reductions. Now, Australia's track record on meeting its emissions trajectories is pretty poor. For years, unfortunately, in Australia, we've thought we were doing something. For example, we've had wind power in Australia for 31 years now, but it still only makes up 6% of our energy generation. So we're really not making very much headway on addressing these problems, particularly because, as we know, wind power is very resources hungry in terms of non-renewable consumption of concrete and steel going into its production. So we'll talk now about the emissions trajectories we should be following. And in this chart we see in figure 12.1, which came out from the Garneau report back in about 2012, the emissions trajectories that Australia needs to achieve was shown very clearly. We see, for example, in that chart, in the dark blue line, the track Australia would have been taking if we'd never attempted to reduce our emissions. We see in the green line on that chart what we call the soft option that Australia negotiated at Kyoto. But where we really need to be going is into that darker orange line or into the brown line down the bottom. One is 550 parts per million scenario, the other is a 450 parts per million scenario. And we know that if we're to limit climate change to 2 degrees, we need to be down on the 450 parts per million. A lower trajectory is now being suggested of 350, and that would coincide with a 1.5 degrees centigrade warming. By the government's reckoning, they think we are tracking down that green line, and so we're showing that in the short red section that's overlaid. In truth, we are not achieving what the government's claiming, because there are a few very important sectors of our emissions that we're not accounting for in Australia. The first deals, of course, with our industrial offshoring. The ongoing destruction of our industrial base means that these emissions are going to China, they're going to Europe, and they're going to other parts of Asia. Now that Ford, Holden, Toyota, Chrysler, Nissan and others have vacated Australia, these emissions from the vehicles they produced are now going to China and to Asia. We're driving more vehicles now than ever, and they're getting bigger and they're getting thirstier. But of course we in Australia no longer account for those emissions. And we should be doing that. We should be making an adjustment that parallels our patterns of consumption. In Australia, we have got other processes that are being offshored, and they're very energy hungry. For example, we've got cement, we've got steel. These processes use a lot of carbon, a lot of coal is produced in them, but steadily our cement is being imported and a lot of our steel is being imported. And yet we are using more of these commodities in Australia than ever. But importantly, fugitive emissions are not being properly accounted for in our national greenhouse gas accounts. Our Department of Environment and Energy know this, and in fact they've virtually stated that on their website. And I'll give you an example of the type of problem we're encountering. In the United States, they have been measuring the fugitive emissions from gas. They have been overflying their sites, and they know that in some areas they're getting emissions leakage of 7 and 8% of production. They think nationally in the United States it may be about 1.6%. But it could be as high as 2.3 based on the latest research. But quite frankly, people do not really know the true number. Here in Australia, we're on a wing and a prayer. We do not take this value into account in our national accounts, and we should be doing that. Because when emissions from methane get up around 2 or 3%, you can see gas plants have a similar level of total greenhouse gas emissions to coal plants, and we need to get on top of this problem. With Australia's extremely poor record in addressing emissions reductions across all sections, which I've just described, it's vital and completely achievable that we ensure that our electricity sector fully decarbonises to the maximum extent possible. And by that, I mean we need to be achieving 90 to 95% reductions by around 2050.